Welcome to the Strong Enough podcast, where we talk about the challenges and celebrate the triumphs of people from all walks of life. I'm your host, Claudia, and this is your co-host, Jen. We are super excited today. We have an amazing guest coming to you from Australia, and we are going to talk about how she rewrote the script on a little golden book and told us how to be your perfectly imperfect self. Please help us welcome Dr. Michelle McQuaid.
Hey, Claudia. Hey, Jen.
Hi, Michelle. How are you today?
Very well. It's a bit bright and early here in Australia. It's about 7 a.m. So we'll give my brain some grace as I warm into things.
I love it. So normally at all hours of the day, we are drinking coffee. In fact, I think, yes, Jen has a cup right now of coffee. I've moved on to flavored seltzer water, but we appreciate you being willing to join us so early because you got some important stuff to say, I feel like.
Thanks, guys. Yes, we've been doing lots of interesting research, as you were touching on in the introduction, around how do we break free of some of the expectations we often grow up with to be good girls or tough guys so that we can be more of our unique selves.
I love that. And I want to know what drove you to want to do research and want to really dive into that kind of stereotypical male female roles that we basically fall into from a very young age.
Yeah, so I grew up in a home that was not that happy. And when adults would ask me, what do you want to be when you grow up? I used to say, I want to be happy. And of course, what they were getting at, like, you're going to be a firefighter or a doctor or a nurse, or like, what are you going to do with your life? And they kind of, say to me, what are you going to do with yourself? And I was like, I want to do things that make me happy. And as a kid, I think for most of us, that felt like the easiest thing in the world. I was going to grow up, then I'd be in charge of my own life, I'd make better choices than my parents did, and I'd be set. And of course, it doesn't quite work out like that, right? And I didn't know, I think as many of us, that I had grown up with some very clear societal expectations. And for me, growing up as someone that was identified as a woman, those expectations were around. I was meant to be a good girl. And a good girl was somebody who performed perfectly, right? I did well at school. I went on and went to university. I got the career. I climbed the corporate ladder all the way to the top of it. And I was like, this is making me miserable. Like, what am I doing wrong here? I also really focused on how did I please other people? How did I make other people happy? Put other people first. God forbid, never be selfish. So I raised a family. I have two beautiful boys now who are 20 and 15. I had good friends. I supported all my family. And I started to get really friggin' resentful about giving and giving and giving to everybody else and feeling like there was nothing left for myself. And then that third idea often that comes with being a good girl was that we are meant to protect everybody else. And so I got really good at silencing myself, at not speaking up. And that created all sorts of challenges through my life that we can talk to. And roughly around about sort of my early 40s, I think as happens for many of us as women, we feel like this burden, if we've been trying to earn love by being a good girl, just gets too much. And so that was true for me. And I really started around that time diving into the research on well-being, positive psychology, human thriving, human flourishing. And I was fortunate because around that time in my life, it was becoming this big new field in the world that there was actually a science to being happy. I was like, geez, that would have been good to know when I was much younger than where I was, because I felt like on paper I ticked all the boxes to earn love and do what was expected of me. But of course, I didn't feel loved in the ways that I imagined were going to make me happy all those years ago when I was a kid. So I threw myself into the science and the research and learned everything I could about how our brains work, how our bodies work, our nervous systems, how we connect with each other. And that gave me many new tools to be able to navigate life. But I keep bumping up against this idea as I was teaching these ideas in workplaces and schools and communities about often we're just too busy to do these things that would help us be well, to flourish, to thrive as human beings. And when I kept scratching below, well, why were we too busy? I kept finding these gender-based stories about, well, I've got to be a good girl and put everybody first, or I've got to be a tough guy and this is all too soft. And, it's the squishy stuff that's not as important in life. And so that was why we went and we wrote the books around, well, how do we break free of these ideas so we can be our unique selves and do what we need to do to feel like we can flourish as we navigate this life.
You mentioned something about always being the good girl, doing things the right way, and pleasing people. Yeah. And I feel like that stems from something that usually happens, in our childhood that makes us want to make the adults around us happy or pleased with us. Yeah. Is that your experience or?
Yeah, so both my lived experience and research experience. Okay. Definitely for me as a little girl, I felt that pressure both at home, at school. We were involved in a Baptist church community to be the good girl and to perform perfectly, to please others, to protect everybody else. That was how I earned love. I think it's even more, Jen, than just how do we make other people happy. I think it's more deeply wired that in order to earn other people's love, I need to be doing these things. Not that inherently, of course, we are all each worthy of love in our perfectly imperfect selves, but this idea that love is conditional. And that was definitely my lived experience at home. I actually, around about the ages 5, Claudia, you mentioned as we were coming in, this little golden book. And by the time I was 5, my parents had divorced. My mum was a single mum. She was a school teacher. There wasn't a lot of money in our house. But sometimes if you got to the end of the weekly shop and there was about 40 cents left in the change she'd get from the cashier handing it back, because my mother was a teacher, what was the ultimate treat was you got to choose a little golden book. And they used to be on the corner of the cashier stand, thing. And so I remember choosing this book. Now, I couldn't really read at that stage, so I didn't know what the title was, but it had this bright yellow cover. And in the middle of the cover, there was this hand-drawn illustration of a little girl about my age, about 5, and she looked so calm and serene. She's just sort of looking straight out at you from the cover. But around the edges of this little girl were smaller versions of her, same little girl, but she was doing things like pulling her sister's hair, throwing a vase on the floor, hiding her head in her hands in shame. And it was really these little illustrations that I felt very related to. I could see that there were some familiar things that were happening on this cover that I was so curious about. And I remember getting this book and giving it to my mother, and she's like, "Are you sure?" And I was like, "Yes." Anyway, the title of the book I learned later that night when the story was being read to me as I went to bed was Good Little, Bad Little Girl. And throughout this storybook, there are all the examples of the good little girl who is quiet and polite and tidy and patient. And then all the examples of the bad little girl who is loud and noisy and messy and demanding. And at the end of the book, we discover there's a big surprise. That's exactly what it says, that the good little girl and the bad little girl were the same little girl. But what she discovered is she made the good little girl grow taller and taller and the bad little girl smaller and smaller. Well, then she was happy and loved. And that's literally what the last page of the book says. And so I made my mother read this story over and over again, night after night after night. I think it was my first self-help book. And I really think I believe that if I just listened enough to what that good little girl did, I'd figure out how to make the good little girl in me grow taller and taller and the bad little girl smaller and smaller. And I share this just as one example, right? When we look at the messages that we give young girls, even still today, all around us, it's so woven in to this idea of we should be good girls and do these things and then we will be happy and loved. And again, often told to us not to harm us, but to try to protect us in a complicated world and to keep us safe. And so what we found then when I started this project just over 2 years ago, we asked other women all over the world, because I was like, is this just a shell thing? Was this just me? Or is this still relevant? And what we found, both in qualitative and quantitative research, was it was absolutely something that many women related to. About sort of 2/3 of women still relate to this idea of needing to be good girls. And what really interested me was it was young women actually were even higher. About 77% of young women 18 to 24 still feeling the pressure today to be these good girls.
You know, one of the things that you mentioned a couple times throughout is earning love. And it made me sad to hear you say that because I do think a lot of people, but primarily women, feel that way. You know, they really do feel like they have to behave a certain way and do certain things to earn other people's love. So, how did that feel to you growing up and even as that 5-year old little girl hearing that book being read and trying to make that good little girl bigger and bigger so that you could earn that love, but never really getting there because you said you were never really happy. So how did that make you feel?
Yeah, so I think number one, we can't earn love, right? Any love that we are earning is not really love, right? Because it's conditional on us continuing to do the thing over and over again to keep earning the love. I don't know about you. That to me is not what love is.
Right.
It might be fitting in, it might be making people happy with you, but it's actually not love. In our research, we talk about this kind of junk food love, I call it, around like it's like a sugar hit. You know, when you have a cookie or something in the afternoon when your energy is dipping, and you sort of, when you have that hit of sugar for the next 30 minutes, you're like, whoa, everything is good. And then you come crashing down even harder about 30 minutes later than where you were before you had the sugar hit. And I think this idea that we're earning love is the same, right? In the moment, when somebody's happy with us, they're approving of us, we feel safe enough, we get maybe a little that glow going on, feels great. But about 30 minutes later, we have this crash out again, and we've got to do something else to keep earning the love, earning the love, earning the love. And to be honest, I didn't understand this pattern until much later in my life, where I've started to look at these stories and what was going on, and to understand that there was this alternative of what I call a healthy or nutritious love, a bit like, you know, instead of 3 o'clock reaching for the sugar and the cookie, instead we're reaching for something that's actually going to replenish and nourish our body. So maybe a piece of fruit or something that still has some of that sweetness, but has some nutritional value in it as well. And that when I have this nutritious love, well, I know that I belong. I know that I am worthy. I know that I'm deserving of love, even in all my imperfection, just like every single one of us are. And so that isn't something that gets taken away from me if I'm in healthy, respectful relationships with people. When I'm imperfect with those people, they kind of love me even more because it gives them some rough edges to hang on to for me. And so, again, this was a big aha. And what we found in our research was it was absolutely not just me. And often what we were seeing is that for women anyway, by the time that they were in sort of their mid 30s to mid 40s, they're often exhausted from trying to do all this earning of the love, right? The junk food love is not very nutritious and sustaining for us. They're often quite resentful about, why do I have to keep giving and giving to everybody else? When does anyone give back to me? And not, of course, realizing that if we don't give to ourselves, then it's hard for anybody else to feel we're worthy of that as well. And then the other piece was that they were reporting just feeling really lost, like, I don't know who I am anymore. I've been so busy twisting myself into the shapes to earn everybody else's love. I don't know who is uniquely me anymore, or what that looks like to thrive. And I think I could definitely relate to that. I'm sure many people listening can as well.
What do you think, you know, at you personally, so aside from your research, what gave you the ability to find the real you? You know, how tough was it to kind of unravel what you had created and really discover the real shell?
Mm. I think, like many of us on that journey, I had to have a breakdown or a breakthrough, depending on how you look at it. Like, I think you try to hang on to that for as long as you can because you believe that that's how the world works. And I believe that that was how the world worked. And it's only when it becomes unsustainable anymore and it cracks you open to let the light in, of course, as Leonard Cohen wisely said, that you start to find, well, who am I? We come back to those questions. And who do I want to be going forward, and how do I want to be in this world? And for me, that happened just over 10 years ago. I mentioned earlier in our story that my parents got divorced when I was quite young. So I was born 1973. And I think what's so interesting about that time in the world is it is in 1973 that women, for the first time in America and Australia, the United Kingdom, other Western style countries, were allowed to have their own bank account and credit card without their father or their husband having to sign permission for them. So it's only just over 50 years ago that actually, technically, we didn't have to earn love in order to have a roof over our head and food under our table. Yeah. And so I think it's really important as we keep playing through these ideas to understand, where did this all come from? Yeah. And the reality is, it is only 50 years ago that women really, if we wanted to have any sort of financial ability to put food on the table and roofs over our heads, those basic safety necessities, we needed to earn the love of a man who was going to pay for those things. Yeah. So my parents, bless them, were really young. I was at my mother's 21st birthday. My father was just back from Vietnam, where he had enlisted by choice, not conscription. He'd had a huge fight with his father, gone and joined up. And while he was in Vietnam, my grandfather had passed away. And so my father not only had the coming home as a Vietnam vet at that time and all the complexities that we had in society around that, but that he'd had this big fight with his dad, and then his dad had passed while he was gone. And so this was a young man in a lot of pain. My mother, bless her, was a country girl, just arrived in the big city, letting loose and cutting wild, and suddenly found herself pregnant to this very challenged young man. And as you did again in those days, particularly as my mother was from a religious family, you got married and you had the child. And so that's what they did. And the first 4.5 years of my life and their life was really just constant trauma. My father was self-medicating with alcohol and drugs because we didn't understand what post-traumatic stress was in those days. My mother was just trying to keep up. There was a lot of violence and a lot of distress in that house. And when I was 4.5, my mother left because in the state where I live, they had just introduced no-fault divorce. And that meant that she could leave and not have to go through a court case detailing all of the traumatic things that were happening in our house, which was just too much for her at that stage. And so she leaves. She's a teacher, so she has some money. She can now get a bank account and a credit card. She can rent a house by herself. I mean, we take these things for granted right now, but these were big things that made it possible for her to leave that very difficult situation. And she decides, right, we're just going to be good now. We're not going to talk about any of that stuff for the last 4.5 years. We're just going to go forward like we have normal, healthy lives, and it never happened. And again, thinking back, that wasn't that unusual at that time. We didn't understand what PTSD was. We didn't understand what trauma was. It was rare to have access to a psychologist. So we were just going to put on that stiff upper lip and get on with life. But of course, for me, the body kept score. And so as I was growing up, I'm still having all these post-traumatic stress reactions, but I don't understand really why it's happening because I was so young in the midst of all of that. We know, of course, now that trauma in those early years does some very interesting things to the way our brains are wired and work, and they kick our nervous system into hypervigilance. And so again, I knew and I remembered enough to know some of what had gone on in that early part of my life. I still seen my dad for a little while until I was 12 on custody visits, and those things were still quite traumatic incidences. And then he disappeared altogether from my life. And so around 12, I'm going through abandonment issues, and even though he was not the best dad by any stretch of the imagination, he was still my dad, and we are still wired to want that connection. So I'm going through abandonment. My mum's kind of, pretending everything's okay, none of this happened. And at 16, I decide this is just like crazy town, and I leave home, which was not the best choice because I was still trying to go to school. I was working on the checkout at Kmart's. Every week was like, is there enough money? I was paying for board. I'd gone from living in a very nice part of town to a very rough part of town. Like, it was a lot for a poor 16-year-old kid to be trying to navigate, but I get through. And so then I sort of go on to school, university, get a career, start traveling the world. And I am, like my mother, determined I am going to be normal. I'm going to get married. I'm going to have a family. Like, just none of that shit happened. But about 10 years ago, my dad was diagnosed with melanoma cancer, and I'm the eldest of four children that he has. And he reached out and said, would I please be his power of attorney to help him wrap up his life? And so this brings everything back for everybody now at a time where we understand a bit more about trauma. And I have a younger sister and I have two half siblings. We really hadn't spent a lot of time together in the midst of all this family dynamic. My dad lives for about 6 months while we try to sort all sorts of things out. But on the other side of that, I was broken down and broken open. And that was really where the healing work had to begin.
Something that I found really interesting that you just said that I think a lot of people can relate to is that even though he wasn't a great dad, he was still your dad and you're supposed to love him. And so you felt that abandonment when you kind of lost him. Will you talk a little bit about reconciling that and how that felt as a good little girl, that he's not there, and so it's good because you're not having that trauma, but you still miss him because he's your dad. Will you talk a little bit about kind of those conflicting feelings?
Yeah, and conflicting, I think, is such the right word for it. And I remember when he kind of disappeared from my life around 12, feeling that it was my job to save him. He was just so misunderstood, and people didn't get that he was a good guy, just, in a hard, and if he would just talk to me, and if he'd just come back into my life, I could save him. And of course, we don't save anyone but ourselves if we're lucky. But many of us don't know that even well into our adult lives. And so I was really, I think, fortunate at that time that he was having no contact with me and that I wasn't able to have any efforts at saving him. And so I really had to start to make peace with the fact that he was gone from my life at that time. And that brought up a lot of, I think, for many of us in that good girl mindset of, well, I was not good enough. I was not good enough. If I had been more lovable, if I had been more supportive, then he would have stayed. He wouldn't have gone. I hadn't tried enough. So there are a lot of years of fairly intense self-criticism and self-loathing kind of reinforce that idea of I have to work harder to earn love. And that was what I did in every other relationship. I got married around the age of 28, and at that time, I felt for the first time a little more peaceful and stable. Again, I felt like I was ticking all the right boxes on the report card. And I did reach out to him. I wrote him a letter. I was actually living in London at the time, and he was still back in Australia. And I wrote to him and I said, look, maybe this matters to you, maybe it doesn't, but for what it's worth, I forgive you. And I remember at that moment in my life, really, I just wanted to be done with all the trauma and the drama. But of course, I wanted to be done without ever actually having done any of the healing work. I was like, I'm just going to forgive and then I'll be done and I can just put this to bed and I can move on with my married life. And
Hey,
so
let me
I
know.
wrote,
Let me know if that ever works out for you.
yes, it never works. Of
Because
course,
you
there is
would
no
be a
shortcut to
multimillionaire,
healing.
sweetheart.
I think your podcast is a testament. There is no shortcut to healing, right? As much as we would like to think there was. So I wrote in this letter from London saying, hey, for what it's worth, I've just gotten married. I want you to know I'm okay. I'm at a good place in my life. I know hard things happened. I know that you came from hard experiences yourself. And if it matters, I forgive you and I wish you nothing but the best. And I felt like that. I remember still sending that letter, feeling like I have wrapped my trauma up in a nice, neat bow, and I can put this package in the cupboard. And there I go. I am all done. Thank you very much. And amazingly, he did write back. And so I lived in London for 2 years, and it's kind of nice during that time we were able to write letters back and forth a little bit without having any pressure to see
Mhm.
each other. And I came home to Australia, and then it was like, okay, well, it would be nice to actually see you. I remember when I wrote the letter to him, this sense of going, if I walked past my father on the street, I wouldn't actually know he was my father, chances are, because it'd been so long since we'd seen each other. And I didn't like that feeling. I didn't like this idea that I could walk past my father on the street and I wouldn't know who he was. And so when I got back to Australia, my younger sister Kim and I went to see him, to visit him. Now, he was living in rural Australia. He was a lifelong alcoholic. That was how he medicated his post-traumatic stress. So to go to see him, we had to see him at 11 a.m. before he got too drunk in the course of the day. He was living a very peaceful life at that stage. He lived out in the bush in a little humpy shack. He only went to town on Thursdays because that was pension day. And the rest of the time he stayed in his little hut by the stream, and he was okay. And so it was nice to see him. It was scary to see him. We were kind of all trying to move forward because I'd wrapped a bow on the trauma, so we weren't talking about any of those things. And for the next few years, as I had my own family in that, we would see each other periodically for these little catch-ups where we could. We lived several hours apart from each other, so again, that gave us a bit of distance. And it felt more peaceful to me. It didn't feel healed, but it did feel a bit more at peace. And then, as I say, when it came, when he was given his diagnosis, that really kind of ripped all the trauma open as my various siblings and I came together and started to face into what had been the truth of our childhoods. And my mother really broke down at that stage because she didn't want me back involved in any way. And so it also ripped a whole lot open in our relationship about all the pretending that had gone on, that this never really happened.
You mentioned healing and peace are two different things.
Yeah.
I personally know the difference. I know Claudia knows the difference, but from your perspective, can you tell our viewers what that difference is to you?
Yeah, so this is not an academic definition in any way.
Oh.
It's just a sample of one. Yeah.
We're asking your personal opinion.
So for me, peaceful felt like I was okay with it. I was okay with what had happened. I felt like I had a reasonable level of understanding. I had let the hurt part of it go, like I wasn't after vengeance or, justice in any way for what had been done. I was just ready to let it go and move on. That was what peaceful felt like. It was like this was just a shit situation all around of a lot of hurt people doing the best they could with what they had in that moment. And that just is what it is. I really wanted to forgive. What I found later when I did the healing work was that in that rush to want to be peaceful, I also was not prepared to hold anybody accountable or set any boundaries of what was okay and wasn't okay around not just what had happened, but what was continuing to happen in some of our relationships in my family dynamic. Being healed meant actually facing in and getting honest, not rushing past it, wrapping it all in a bow, but actually looking it in the eye and going, that was fucked up. And that was not good enough. That was absolutely not okay. And I deserved better than that and to be treated more lovingly than that. And again, it's not just of what had happened in those first few years of my life. It was the decades-long trail that had continued in all of our relationships and really, again, blew up during that time of my dad's illness at the end of his life, where suddenly all these things we could see weren't wrapped up in a neat box and pushed to the back of the cupboard. They were still in play. It's just that most of the time we were trying to keep that lid on the box all the time and stop things jumping. So healing meant going back, taking the lid off that box, actually taking all the crap out of it, sitting with it honestly and not trying to sugarcoat it or rush past it, to own the pain and the hurt that came with that, to ask for the accountability from people that were involved in it, not from a place again of shame or blame, but to at least ask for accountability and acknowledgement that that was not okay.
Well, that spurred another question for me then.
Yeah.
So what if a person can't have somebody be accountable to? Like, what if the relationship is either so damaged or the person is no longer living and you're having to, so how would you give advice on that aspect of it?
Or just crappy
Yeah.
and won't take accountability.
And they won't take
Yes.
accountability. Yeah. Yeah. So it was interesting. There were some dimensions of this in play for me. As I mentioned, my father had been diagnosed as terminally ill with cancer. So he was in the end of his life. What happened was my half-sister had confronted him several years before about sexual abuse that she experienced with him. And he had denied that and said that her mother, my stepmother, was lying and making it up, and that he was cutting her out of the will. Now, to be clear, the will had, maybe $10,000 in it, but that was his mechanism. And then when we all came back together as he was dying, it was the first time I'd seen my half sister really in decades. And she came to see him to recant, to say, "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have accused you of it. My stepmother made it up. Please forgive me." And it was in the moment that she was doing that I was like, but this is true. And I know it's true because he sexually abused myself and my other sister as well. And so I could see this beautiful young woman, like, again, like wanting to put the bow on the box and put it in the cupboard and go, just didn't happen. And I was like, that's actually not right for you. Never mind him, never mind me, but that is not true. And I don't want you stuck in that situation for the rest of your life of not being able to be honest for yourself about what happened. And so I said to her, that's actually not, I think he did sexually abuse you because what you're describing is similar to my experience. And then my other sister stepped forward and said, and it's similar to mine. And it was the first moment we realized that all three of us had had this experience with him. And so we didn't confront him. Again, he was in his last weeks of life. Again, it was a choice individually that we each made because we felt, based on the way he'd responded to my half-sister so far, he wasn't ready to be honest or take any accountability for it. But there was something in knowing that truth with each other that was so freeing for all three of us to go, okay, and to start to be able to talk about this was not okay. Yes, this was a very traumatized person with horrible personal history of his own, and that didn't make it okay to then do this. So even among ourselves, to have some normalized, and whether that's in your family, whether that's with support groups, whether that's with a therapist, I do think there is something around that accountability of being able to talk to somebody who can help give you some perspective that that was not okay and you deserve to be treated better than that. There was such freedom in that. I did then go and confront my mother after my father had passed, and I said, this sexual abuse happened. Why have we never talked about it? And to be honest, I really expect that she would deny that it happened as well. She surprised me. Her first question was, well, when did this happen? And I said, look, my memory are custody visits. And she was, well, there weren't very many of those. And then we didn't talk about it for 2 years. And I remember being in such shock, number one, that she hadn't denied it. And that number two, then she had dismissed it with, well, there weren't many. I was like, how many instances did it need to be a problem?
Right.
Like,
That's
oh
too
my
much.
God.
It's too many.
And so I spent this next 2 years, I think, honestly, deeply in shock. That she had known, that we had never talked about it. Again, I understand sort of when I was growing up, you didn't talk about these things, but she's a trained social worker. We've lived a lot of years. We were still in close contact and relation, never to have talked about it. And then when I did finally have the courage to do it, to dismiss it in that way. And again, I understand she was probably shocked in that moment as well that I was bringing it up. But then for 2 years not to come back to it seemed a long time. And it took me 2 years to get really mad about that, to get mad enough to go back to her and say, this is not okay. Like, it was not okay then, and it is not okay now. And I can't be in a respectful relationship with you and feel safe in relationship with you if you can't acknowledge that this was not okay. And at that time, she really couldn't. She wasn't at a place where she was ready to admit that any of this had really happened for herself. We were still busy with the lid on the box. We took several years apart. I needed time away from her. Number one, to do my own healing work, because I think, Jen, to your point then, all I had left when she wouldn't take accountability was that I had to take accountability for me and what was okay and wasn't going to be okay for me going forward. And what wasn't going to be okay was for people to keep denying or downplaying this thing that had happened in my family of origin. And so over those years, bless her, she did go and start doing more of her work and her healing on it. And we have been able to reconcile and are in process of rebuilding our relationship. But there was no guarantee she was ever going to get there. What I knew was I had to start showing up for me and setting boundaries that were healthy for me. And that's what needed to happen that never did when I was a kid for that healing to occur.
I love that. I love that you kind of said I took accountability for me and what my boundaries were going to be and what I was going to say was acceptable and not, because I do think a lot of people run into that situation where the person doesn't take accountability, whether it's they're not willing to, they're gone, so many reasons. And so many people then feel unresolved and they feel like, well, now I can't heal. It's not my fault though, because
Yeah.
they didn't take accountability. So I can just be victimy and unhealed, but it's cool because like it's their
Yeah.
fault. And
Yeah.
I really appreciate you talking about the accountability. Jen has a great saying about trauma and
Oh,
healing.
I'm so sorry that the trauma was not your fault, but unfortunately, your healing is your responsibility.
I love that. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, even if the other people around us aren't ready to do that healing or take that
Mhm.
responsibility, Claudia, to your point, we can. And what we found in the research actually with the women that we did around how did they break free of these good girl beliefs if they weren't serving them well, there were three things. And interestingly, they'd been the three things on my own journey that over this last decade had helped that healing process. And the first was self compassion. It was remembering that we are all perfectly imperfect, that nature made us this way so that we could learn and grow and adapt and evolve as the world around us and within us keeps changing. So rather than beating myself up about I wasn't good enough, I wasn't lovable enough, I hadn't been strong enough, I started to just go, you know what, kiddo, you're perfectly imperfect and you were doing the best you could with what you had at the time, just like everybody else in this scenario had as well. And the second skill then is secure attachment. So, of course, we often hear a lot about secure attachment to our parents early in life and how important that is for our overall health and well-being. But what happens when you don't have that, right? I had no secure attachment, I think, as many of us that have grown up with trauma experience. So then are we just screwed for the rest of our lives or what goes on? What I love in the most recent research around secure attachment is they're now looking at it in terms of self. So how do I feel securely attached to me? How do I take responsibility, accountability for me? And again, it's a bit of that reparenting work, right? I had to go back and show up for myself in the ways that my parents hadn't been able to. And part of that is learning to set healthy boundaries to go, I will show up for me, I will advocate for me, I will set boundaries for me, so that then I knew I had responsibility. That was where so much of the healing happened, because I finally felt safe enough in myself to know that I was worthy of love and I would not put up again with people treating me in ways that were not respectful. And then the third skill is around self-leadership. And this is using some of the recently popular therapeutic work around internal family systems, where we start to understand in each of us as like this little family of parts that often again grow up in our early years of life doing the best they can with what we have, but then don't realize that I'm now a 52-year-old woman and I probably don't need those same protection mechanisms that I had when I was a 4-year-old kid in that situation. And so instead of kind of being that hyper vigilant, overprotective as I try to navigate my way through life, how do I learn to soothe my nervous system down a little bit so that I can be more curious and creative and compassionate and courageous, all those things we each have access to when we feel like we're at our best. But when we're in the midst of trauma, we tend to switch off so often because we're just too worried that we're under threat or under attack or not feeling supported or that we're not loved. And so we act from that place of pain rather than the place of love.
I quickly need to say, I would need to see like a sworn affidavit of your age because I'm not buying it. Are you
Yeah.
buying it?
Not really.
I'm not buying it.
No.
I'll shoot the
So
birth certificate over.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
yeah, super cute,
Right.
but we're not buying it. I want to go back really quickly before we kind of go forward and talk about your book. You talked about with your dad, feeling like if I could heal him, if I could have fixed this, if I could have done that. Did you ever feel that way regarding your parents' marriage? And if so, did you feel guilt over that? How did you reconcile that as a little girl and then growing up?
Yeah, I don't think for me I felt guilty about their divorce because it was such a shit show. I mean, I can't begin to do justice and don't want to because I don't want to traumatize anybody else listening to what those first 4.5 years in our home were like. It was just horrendous, and we regularly had police there night after night trying to deal with the fallout of what was happening in our house. So I think when we left and suddenly we were in a calmer house, I was just like, oh, thank God. And nobody wanted to go back to that. What I did do, though, both in feeling I wanted to save my dad, was I felt incredibly responsible for my mother. And in particular, because she had gotten pregnant with me from a young age, and I'd always known that part of the story, I'd been raised on it. And it felt like it had cost her her life in so many ways. And so it was my job to go on and live the life that my mother didn't get to live. And so I think that incredible sense of responsibility for both of my parents individually to want to heal and try to make right what was that incredible trauma that we all grew out of in my early years.
That is so much weight to carry on your shoulders. I mean, as an adult, but especially as a child. But I think a lot of us do that. And
Yeah, I
it's
don't think that's uncommon at all. I think
Yes.
many, especially if we've seen a parent traumatized as part of it,
Yeah.
we feel that responsibility for trying to make it better. And then if we feel, again, often as we do it, kids, that in any way we're to blame for that trauma or that situation, that
Mhm.
we want to do everything we can to make it up to them. Yeah.
It's almost like if they hadn't had me, they wouldn't have been in this situation, or like not saying that you were
Exactly.
trying to like quote unquote save the marriage, but like almost like save them. Like if it weren't
Yeah.
for my mom getting
Yeah.
pregnant with me, like,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
hate that you had that mentality, but I feel like in so many, your mother was obviously a very broken woman to begin with. And I mean, I say this all the time, abuse never happens in a vacuum. Like, I'm sorry if there's a sexual abuse going on in your
Yeah.
household,
Yeah.
there's other abuse, verbal, physical, emotional, all of that's going on in a household.
Yeah.
So I'm sure your mother was a massive victim of emotional and, maybe even physical as well.
Yeah.
And like, but I hate that her trauma bled all over you. And that's what caused you to like really have this sense of like, oh gosh, this was my fault. When as an innocent child, adults make decitions, y'all.
right.
Yeah,
And you just wanted to be
absolutely.
happy.
Yeah, you just wanted
Yeah,
to
I
be,
just
you
wanted to
just
be
wanted to
happy,
live
make
a
it all
happy, peaceful.
okay. But I also think it's so interesting. I have two boys. My son, my eldest, is 20, and so even though when he was born, there was none of that happening, yeah, in our home. It was nothing like what I'd been raised in. I was still doing a lot of my healing through, the first 12 years of his life, and so he had a side seat to, watching me sort of. And again, while we were not sharing things that were not appropriate for him, he could see and sense, and so even recently we were talking about, that I'm so sorry that he grew up with a mum that isn't where I am now. If I was where I was now as he was younger, I do think for him his nervous system and the way he navigates life would be different. And so I think for all of us as parents, right, we do the best we can with what we have in that moment. And then what I loved about our recent moment on this was I got to take accountability for him so he doesn't have to keep carrying it forward for me.
Okay, real quick, what you just said, and I want you to kind of touch on this a little bit more because I talk about this a lot too with healing. Because you said you were still going through the journey. I feel like a lot of people think it's this one landmark that we have that we hit. It's a special Bible verse. It's a special quote that Claudia is going to tell me, and I'm going to go see the magic witch doctor, and they're going to, But you literally said like you were still over through the process. So I really feel like you should touch on that and about the process and how like it is a process. And there are valleys and mountains through that process.
Oh, definitely. So, and again, if I come back to my researchy, data nerdy part of myself, what I had learned was that our brain is rewired by trauma, no matter what age we experience it at. It's a deep impact on the way we are. And whether that's a one-off trauma or it's years of it, as I had, it changes the way our brains are functioning. And so, in order to rebuild or rewire those parts of our brains so that we do feel more safe, and our nervous system is more connected and not constantly hypervigilant and responding from a protection place where we're not able to make our choices as clearly or compassionately or courageously. We need to rewire that. And on average, again, there's lots of debates around these numbers, but to rewire parts of our brain typically is a journey of about maybe 7 to 10 years on average. Depends what we're rewiring, where our starting place is, what we're doing. But the thing I would take rather than the amount of time is the fact it takes time. We are rewiring the way our brains and bodies are working, and that does not just happen overnight as much as it's why there's no shortcut to the healing. I mean, I think our purpose in life is to keep learning and growing right till our last day on this earth. So although I feel like a lot of my healing has now moved through and I feel like I'm standing on more solid ground on the other side of that, I'll absolutely keep healing until the day that I die. But I feel like a lot of the glut of what was there has been processed in a way I can talk about it for myself and others in a more healthy place.
Let's talk about the perfectly imperfect little girl. Tell us, how you decided to create that and a little bit about the process and what we can expect from that when we pick that book up or flip
Yes.
through it on your Kindle or your
Yes.
note.
Yeah, absolutely, wherever you pick it up. So I was talking about that little golden book that I had as a kid, and when I was breaking down and breaking through, I was like, I have to find that book again. I need to rewrite it. And I went on eBay amazingly and found a copy of this book. And I thought it was a personal therapy session. And then kind of life got busy and I stuck it in the cupboard and I never quite did it. And about 2 years ago, I was in the ultimate cliche, I was trekking through the mountains in Nepal and I'm sitting on the mountain in Nepal and I'm like, okay. And I felt like I'd done a lot of my personal healing at that stage and was coming out the other side of that process. And I was like, mountain, what is next? And the mountain said to me, well, Shell, joyfully follow what calls to your heart. And I was like, mountain, that sounds so wise. What does that look like? And the mountain had nothing else to say on that day. So I came down from the mountain going, what the heck joyfully calls to my heart? Like, it was the first time in my life I was really at this place of feeling safe enough and grounded enough and happy to be uniquely me enough to actually think about, well, what does joyfully call to my heart? Anyway, about 6 months later, the book came out of the cupboard and I was like, oh my God, I want to rewrite this book, but not just for me. Because by now I'd written several other books and I was used to doing these research projects. And I was like, I want to write this for every little girl, no matter what her age, out there that maybe grew up with these ideas. And so as a researcher, I was like, okay, well, let's get some people together and see what does it mean to be a good girl these days to them. And so we did research groups with women all over the world. And we started to find these 3 themes around performing perfectly, pleasing everyone, protecting others. And then we started to find that when they broke free of these ideas, what was possible. And that was where we kept finding these skills around self-compassion and secure attachment and self-leadership. I'm like, okay, there's something here that could be really useful to be able to package up and share with women. And so the first thing I did with my collaborator, the wonderful Evie Wright, was we rewrote the storybook and we got an illustrator to help us create these beautiful illustrations of the perfectly imperfect little girl. So it's an adult storybook. There's an adult and a kid's version. The adult version has some rude words in it, as little girls who are imperfect should use, I think. But we appreciate that's not for everyone, and there is a kid's version with no swearing. But the other piece we did was we created the Perfectly Imperfect Women's Journal. And this journal is full of all the little evidence-based practices that I used on my own healing journey, that research would support to build those skills of self-compassion and secure attachment and self-leadership.
That is awesome.
I love it. I think I think we all need a copy, it sounds like.
I mean,
Where can we find it? So if we and others want to grab a copy of those, where's the best place to get it?
Yeah, so head to thegoodgirlgamechangers.com. That's our website. You'll find the books right up there, and you can get it from anywhere in the world. Any online bookstore seller will have it, or you can go into a local bookstore and ask them to order it in for you.
Oh, I love that. Shop local.
yes.
What's next? Do you have another book in the works? What's next for you professionally?
Yeah, so on the website, we podcast regularly ourselves with women and researchers around this area, and we've done a couple of seasons. We're just starting our next season at the moment, and we are looking into this idea of gender compassion. And I really want to come into the male side of this story, but I'm also conscious that's not my own personal lived experience. I think what's been so fascinating the last few years is there are some really leading gender researchers in the world who are coming out and saying, we wish we'd never made this about gender. We wish we'd made it about human thriving, regardless of gender. That actually, the more we stay stuck in a gender lens, thinking that men and women are different when it comes to the ways we thrive in the world, the more, number one, we keep perpetuating these ideas. And number two, actually now we have enough research on human thriving that suggests it's not gender specific, that we actually all start out in the world with the same capability, boys and girls, up to around the ages of somewhere between 4 and 7. We're all as good at the emotional and social skills that it takes to thrive. But then this conditioning starts to kick in for us, and boys learn to be these real men or tough guys where they need to be more dominant and competitive and assertive, and these are the only acceptable emotions. And women learn to silence themselves in order to be the good girls everybody needs them to be. And then this plays out for both genders, often again through to sort of mid-30s, mid-40s, when we break down and hopefully break through and we start looking for a different way to be out the other side of that. And so those skills of self-compassion and secure attachment and self-leadership, they're not gender specific. There are decades of research in those skills, and none of it suggests that one gender has more access to those skills than another one. So we're really interested in how do we stop pointing the fingers of blame at each gender about who's got it better and who's got it worse, as we see so much of, and how do we start to have some compassion for what each gender experiences, whilst also holding space for accountability around how we each show up with that to the conversation we've been having. And I'm really excited, number one, about trying to have more of that conversation. I think we can see it starting to pop up in different parts of the world. And then number two, maybe there's a tough guy version of the book as well. We'll see. I feel like I need the right male collaborator to bring their lived experience to that.
Right on. Well, if you're the right male collaborator and you're watching
Come
or
talk to
listening right
us.
now, you need to check out Shell. Before we let you go, we're gonna change topics here real quick. We're gonna wrap up with a little tattoo talk. We love
Absolutely.
tattoos.
Yes.
We have a lot
Why
of
wouldn't you?
tattoos. Uh, I heard that you might have a couple tattoos. I'd love to hear about your most meaningful tattoo to
Yeah.
you.
So I think of my tattoos are just my body art, right? It's the art that I wear on my body. And I think like many of us who add tattoos, body art to us, they are important signs of healing milestones on the journey. And that for me, my first tattoo is probably my most meaningful one because I'm needle phobic. So the idea for me of getting a tattoo was not a small thing. It was taken a lot to get past it. But when I was 50, I went and walked the Camino Trail, and I was winding up a 25-year marriage, very happily with my ex-partner. We were in a place of peace around that. And as you do, again, a bit of the cliche, I headed off onto the Camino Trail in Spain to go take a very long walk by myself and just figure out where I was at and what was next. And on that walk, I had this vision of this tattoo, having it on my first tattoo was on the inside of my left wrist there, and it it is the word believe, and it has a little butterfly at the end of it, because butterflies for me are kind of my spirit animal. And so the word believe was there to just believe that I was loved, believe that I was good enough, believe that I could do what was ahead of me. And I wanted it on the inside of my wrist, so I would see it every day as I was reaching for things or doing things, to remember to just keep believing. Wasn't long after that, the other wrist ended up with a tattoo that's actually, it's written in reverse, it's written backwards, and it is the word wanted. And it was to, again, remind me every day that I am wanted. So even though I had this very difficult start in life, it didn't mean that I'm not wanted. At the back of my spine, coming into the base of my brain stem there, because I know that's where we process all the information our brain is getting every day, is the word loved, again with the butterfly at the top of the neck. And when I came down from the mountain in Nepal, on the inside of my feet, coming out to my big toes, is move energy on one foot and make space on the other foot. And all of them each ends in the same little butterfly at the top of it. So those are the tattoos.
Love it. Do we have any in the future plan? Do we have any thoughts?
I don't know. Every now and then something will come to me. I was doing some work recently, and remembering that we are all just stardust, right? We all are just literally, physically, when you look at the makeup of us, we are stardust. And so we all have this in common. We all belong to each other. So there is some thought about maybe some stardust coming somewhere, perhaps elsewhere on my hand at some point. But at the moment, we're just kind of sitting with that and seeing where it takes us. Instead, I bought some very sparkly Ugg boots that when I put them on my feet in the morning, I remember we are all just gold stardust. So that's working right now as well.
You know what? I'm not mad at some nice shoes to give you the vibe that you're feeling. I think we can both. We love that.
Yes.
So, do you have any cliche trips coming up?
I do. I'm off to Africa to go get primal with the animals and dance with the Maasai in about 2 months' time. So
Awesome.
that's the next cliche trip. We'll see what comes out of that.
That's right. I bet a tattoo will come out.
Oh, a tattoo should
come out of that for sure.
Yeah.
Michelle, you have been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today, sharing about your life, but also about what others can do as they move through trauma and figure out how to not be that perfect person, but they can be perfectly imperfect. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Claudia. Thanks, Jen. It was such a pleasure.
Oh, and real quick before we leave, where can people find you?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So thegoodgirlgamechangers.com is our website. You can find the books, the podcast. There's lots of free tools there that you can download. So head there, or if you're on LinkedIn or Substack and you look up Michelle McQuaid, you will find me there as well.
Okay. Or go to Africa in 2 months' time and track
and I'll see you dancing with the Maasai.
Right. Get in on the dancing.
There you go.
Michelle, thank you so much. You have been awesome. I hope you have a wonderful trip, and we would love to see you again here soon.
Absolutely.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to the Strong Enough podcast. You can find us on your favorite podcast platform by searching Strong Enough. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Strong Enough Pod. If you have suggestions for an upcoming episode or a future guest, please reach out at strongenoughpod@gmail.com. Remember, you are worth it.